Welcome to Good Revenue. I'm Neetha Bidway. Today we're going to talk about global power plays, starting with the new US-EU trade agreement, China's tight hold on rare earths, and how the EU is using AI to lead global governance. Finally, we'll also talk about a story involving JPMorgan's data squeeze and how it's affecting fintechs. As always, you can find links to everything we talk about in the show notes. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. Thanks for joining us. Trade with Europe just got quite a bit more expensive, but it's not actually as bad as it could have been. The US and EU just announced a 15% tariff deal today. That is 5 times more than the 3% tariffs that the US imposed on the EU before 2025. But it is quite a bit less than the 30% tariff that the president had been threatening up until quite recently. Here are the specifics in terms of some of the affected areas. So tariffs are going to apply to things like cars, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals, aircraft, certain chemicals, and some key raw materials will be exempt from tariffs, but we don't have any specific product lists yet, so stay tuned for that. Steel tariffs will remain at 50%, and there are still some ongoing negotiations for quotas for both steel and aluminum, according to news reports. In addition, the EU has committed to buying $750 billion in US energy over the next 3 years, according to the New York Times. The EU has also agreed to increase US investments by $600 billion. There are no clear timelines for that one. And the emergency auto tariffs have been dropped. So instead of being 27.5%, they'll be 15%, according to Reuters. 15% auto tariffs are still well above historical norms. So that may be a challenge and is likely going to drag down the European auto sector a bit. Analysts are warning that across the EU, they will expect to see consumer prices rising and a 0.5 percentage point decline in GDP, also from Reuters. Markets have actually responded pretty positively. I think everyone feels like the worst case scenario has been avoided, at least for the short term. And in terms of specific country by country reactions, the Germans are positive, cautiously so, while the French are very unhappy and appear to be condemning the agreement. Now, this agreement still has to be ratified by all of the 27 member states in the EU, so that could be interesting. As of yet, agriculture and pharmaceutical issues still remain unresolved, and those are important for both the US and the European Union, so that may still be a little bit rocky. But regardless, as Europe is grappling with this new regime and reality of higher trade costs, it's also stuck between a rock and a hard place as it looks east. Up next. The EU is stuck between a rock and a hard place. America wouldn't budge on tariffs, and China isn't budging when it comes to Ukraine, rare earths, and dumping goods into European markets. The latest EU-China summit reached narrow agreements on climate cooperation and rare earths export. China's agreed to fast-track some rare earths export licenses, which would solve some of the bottlenecks that the EU is experiencing in tech, defense, and automotive sectors. Despite limited progress on rare earths in the broader picture, there are broad and deep trade tensions because the EU has a persistent trade deficit with China to the tune of 300 billion euros annually. Those trade divisions are compounded by the fact that there are also deep divisions over Ukraine. China continues to be supportive of Russia's invasion, and that is complicating the geopolitical dynamic across the board. In addition, trade frictions are persistent when it comes to manufacturing exports, especially electric vehicles and renewable energy equipment. Ongoing tariffs and anti-dumping has been a real challenge on both sides, and the EU is trying desperately to rebalance trade relations. In addition, the EU and Ukraine have agreed in principle to modernize their free trade agreement. They seek to establish a long-term, predictable, reciprocal trade framework that protects EU agriculture and also gives Ukraine a path towards ascending into the European Union. So while the geopolitics in the EU are pretty tricky on all fronts right now, they do seem to be having a lot more success when it comes to regulating AI. More on that next. Europe is leading the AI governance race. The EU AI Act for General Purpose AI goes into effect this coming week on August 2nd, and it will set new global rules for AI providers. Providers have to submit technical, detailed documentation and summaries of their training data to European regulators. Providers also have to comply with EU copyright laws, and they have to share information with regulators as well as downstream users of their technology. High-risk AI models also have to undergo risk assessments, incident reporting, and they have to adopt enhanced cybersecurity measures. There's a voluntary general purpose AI code of practice that exists according to the EU to reduce compliance burdens, and it has penalties for violations. Those penalties won't go into effect for another year, so that's August 2nd of 2026. Microsoft plans to sign that voluntary code, and they also plan to work closely with EU regulators. Google is largely aligned with the regulations, but they haven't publicly committed to signing the code. And Meta has been public in rejecting it under the grounds that it may be too heavy-handed for their taste. We'll see how that turns out. These rules apply to providers that are placing or heavily modifying AI models in the European Union market. That's defined as over 1/3 of their training data. Some open source and smaller developers are actually exempt from all of this. As Europe enforces AI rules, there's a new fight for data brewing in the United States. JPMorgan just announced that it's going to charge tech companies for accessing its customer data. So for companies like Plaid and Yodlee, there will be new fees that depend on the type and amount of data that is accessed, with a higher price being expected for payments data. In May 2025, the CFPB, that's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, reversed course. They lifted a ban that prevented banks from charging fintechs for consumer financial data access. So now banks can charge for that. JPMorgan says that these new fees are going to cover the costs of infrastructure and security because they're getting as many as 2 billion requests a month for this data. They also note that many of these data requests are not actually directly linked to fintech use. Now, critics say that JPMorgan is just trying to protect its own business and that they're blocking competitors from competing with them. Small fintech startups are particularly concerned. Those in payments and in crypto seem to be the most nervous, according to reporting. And larger fintech firms like PayPal or Square, aka Block, seem to be less concerned, mostly because they're large enough players that this may or may not matter too much to their business. As of yet, there aren't any other big US banks that have announced that they're going to charge for data, but it appears that some are considering it. These new data fees might change the way that fintechs work with large banks and with their own customers. So we'll keep an eye on this one. And as always, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard, leave us a review, subscribe to the show, or check out another episode. We appreciate your support.